Ms. Gray.
Yeah. Just a question, not of the speakers, but our role as a council is to prioritize the levies based on economic value.
Yes.
Correct?
Well, we are instructed. We're instructed by our legislation to recommend a state investment policy for levies in California, which, as we've defined it in the plan, will include some kind of levy standards being identified clearly for the areas within our jurisdiction.
Why is it important in terms of the whether or not Bethel Island is a legacy island or just a community? Why is that an issue with this?
Well, starting with Mr. Machado's observation, the assumption is that the assumption is by some people, whether legally correct or not, that designation by a state agency of a area as a legacy community entitles it to special status, which implies state funding. I'm sure your experience is that's not unlike a lot of other areas of life where if you get a special recognition, you want money to follow. But beyond that, for our purposes of the Delta Plan, we have constructed a few policies and several recommendations trying to further refine what a legacy community is. The phrase is mentioned in state law. A clear definition of it with boundaries is not. City boundaries are recognized, county boundaries are recognized, but for legacy communities, they carry no inherent geographical boundary. We have referenced areas in the Delta Plan for the legislative declared legacy communities, incorporating where appropriate boundaries recommended in county general plans, and Rio Vista's a city, a incorporated city, Isleton's an incorporated city, and the problem with Bethel Island, as you know, is there's a whole mix of stuff going on and a long legacy that confuses things.
Well, we've certainly heard a very passionate comments from our speakers, so I would like to just make sure that language or that those comments are incorporated in what the council will consider.
Well,
in terms of Mr. Grindstaff's comments back to the council at some point.
Well, I don't know what you're suggesting.
Well, I'm suggesting that what your comments are, if they can be provided in writing, that you provide them to Joe, and Joe can look at them and see whether or not there's some options or some changes in the writing of the plan, that section.
Yes. The key issue for us, we've spent 2 hours, but the real key issue is what are the boundaries of the legacy communities, or the legacy community for Bethel Island. Should we include the entire island as a legacy community or not, at least as regards this chapter? And then there are many issues about linkages and language that are in the chapter. There are, in fact, some potential benefits if you are listed as a legacy community, because, in fact, we, in our policy prioritizing levy expenditures, mention legacy communities. So the council can always change what's in that proposed policy, but so that's the key issue for us. And I have not heard direction from the council except to come back after evaluating all of this discussion and bring a written proposal, maybe with a couple options for the next council meeting.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, thank you very much.
One comment I'd like to make
and
on Joe's
we've got to move on to the next chapter.
Well, I've got one comment on Joe's comment is that he's either looking at the current defined boundary or the entire island. I'd also encourage you to take a third look and make sure that you have an option open. And at least if you're going to define the boundaries of a community, define the population boundaries of that community and not a vacant section of the community, excluding the population.
And it will include that alternative of a modified version.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. One last comment, just so you know, like there are 2 houses that are next to me are the original houses of the people who built the levees. They're still there today. So there's a lot of history in Bethel Island today.
That's why they look at it like
Mr. Ringelberger, last speaker. Fast, please.
I'll be short. I just received notice.
No, start talking when you get to the microphone, not before, please.
Don't want me bellowing across here. Local agencies in North Delta, I just received a request from Reclamation District 554, which is Walnut Groves Reclamation District. They had some concerns about the boundary and some existing work. With your permission, I'll provide that information to staff as soon as I receive that.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go to Chapter 6, Mr. Ray.
No other instructions then?
Well,
Obviously, we need to work on the...
I'll just tell you what I think. I think when we get to Chapter 7, which hopefully will be in 20 minutes, we're going to get to the fundamental question is how much money should the state pay for whatever protections people think they need in the Delta. That is a discussion worth having, and I think most of the clarity will flow from that discussion and not from the water quality section. Now, that's just me, of course. Don.
Well, as far as any further direction, I think, Dan, the discussion kind of embodies, some of the outstanding issues, ever how small or big they might be, and I think that Joe summarizing certainly the discussion about Bethel Island, that's, we'll get the options and some further, recommendations coming forward. But again, I don't really in further direction from my perspective. I think that some of the issues are still out there. Some of them are common to previous discussions. Others, I think, have been emphasized here today. So I guess I'd wait and see what you brought back to us a couple weeks from now. So.
Okay.
Okay, well,
Mr. Ray.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6, members, starting on page 205 in your draft Delta plan. Text starts on page 207.
The plan recognizes that the primary policy setting responsibility for water quality protection rests with the State Water Resources Control Board and the Regional Water Quality Control Board. And because of that, this chapter proposes no policies. Instead, it has a set of 12 recommendations directed primarily to the water quality control boards, and both at the regional and state level, that encourage them to protect water quality to meet the Delta's needs, to encourage improvements in drinking water quality, and to improve environmental water quality. And we have no suggested revisions. We haven't identified any outstanding issues that haven't been previously discussed and resolved by the council.
Okay. Questions by members of the council? Don? Felicia?
I just had a couple comments.
Okay. Shh.
I can
A little closer to the microphone.
Sorry, I can give these subsequently. One of the things that struck me here is I know that the earlier drafts were very dense and very, very technical. This one's easier to read, but there's some stuff left out in a way. I mean, I don't find that the setup really matches the recommendations, whether or not the policy. Like, I was looking for CV salts. You have a participation in CV salts in the recommendation, but you don't really talk about CV salts in the problem setup. So I just, I can do a more specific set of recommendations here, but my main consideration is this should be a heavier chapter than it is. I don't mean padding it, but I think you took too much out in this one too. Sorry, Dan. I know you're doing your word count and keystrokes, but I do.
Here.
One other thing, I also think on the issues here you do have a big issues for future evaluation, which I like as a spelled out thing. I still think on the small and disadvantaged communities we could say more, like get them bottled water in the short term. I think on a lot of these issues we're kind of weak on near term actions throughout the report. I think because it's been so hard to deal with the things we're dealing with. That's one of my overall concerns, is that we need to step back and say, what should we be recommending to the governor, legislature, or agencies in the short term a little more? I know it's been improved since earlier drafts, but I want to hear what the panel has to say on it. But that sort of jumped out at me when I read it. I was kind of looking under the covers for more here than there was here.
Joe, I just want to weigh in first with a couple of things you already know about. One, I think we don't start this chapter with an explanation of why we have chosen not to try to use policies, regulations in this. And it's primarily for two reasons. There is already a comprehensive regulatory structure in the state and the regional water boards with clear authority, not unlimited, but clear authority. Secondly, our ability to regulate beyond that is not clear, although there was some earlier language which made it possible. But I think saying something like that up front helps explain this entire chapter. Secondly, I don't think the chapter points out what, personally, I think the evidence suggests is most important. Water quality is likely to become far more contentious an issue than it currently is in the future, because the supply requires the use and reuse and reuse and reuse of water throughout the state of California, and inevitably that implies that human use always deteriorates water somewhat. And if you more frequently use water, the questions of returning it in an acceptable level is bound to create commotions between people who think somebody else ought to pay the bill. And so the importance of water quality is likely to increase in the future, and in many ways flows directly from actions that will be taken that people would prefer not to take if there were an endless supply of currently unused water that could be rolled around the state easily and cheaply. So, to me, that adds a sense of reality to the issue that is lacking. Then number two, you've got this complicated Delta water beneficial uses chart in here, and the question, I think I understand what this is about. It's an analytical tool, but the resolution of conflicts between beneficial uses, at least in California, is governed ultimately by the provisions of the state constitution, the public trust doctrine, and in some cases federal law. And it just kind of popped beneficial use of water is fine, but what do we do with it? How do we resolve conflicts? Then last point, the performance measures here are not quantifiable. We spend 3.5 pages talking about dissolved oxygen as a problem, including a chart on, I'll find the page here in a minute, whatever the chart is, where we use dissolved oxygen as a way to talk about adaptive management and decisions in the future, but we don't have a performance measure on dissolved oxygens. I mean, it doesn't make any sense if you spend 3.5 pages talking about it that you wouldn't have a performance measure on dissolved oxygen. We say it's a big deal in the Stockton Ship Channel, or maybe we say it's a big deal in parts of the Suisun Marsh. But I mean, this relates back to earlier conversation. But were I you, I would try to read this chapter where you have, I think, correctly pointed out major ingredients, problem areas of water quality, and then decide a few of them that have a measurable capacity to be judged and use those as performance measures. DO just strikes me as one, given the extensive discussion that's in the plan now. That's all. That's mine. Randy?
That's good.
No? Okay. All right. Mr. Ray, how would you want to proceed on the panel? Down the line again?
I think that's your choice.
Mr. Zuckerman.
I just had a couple of quick comments, and I think the discussion of salinity in the Delta is somewhat misleading in a couple of aspects. The reference to the agricultural needs regarding salinity are limited to a discussion of the South Delta, where the water quality needs are somewhat less stringent than they are in the organic soils farther into the Delta. And
Starting on page 214, members.
Yeah, it's really 216, the bottom there. The discussion is limited to the South Delta, and it's a different situation. So you need to have a more complete explanation of what the agricultural salinity requirements are. The other thing is there's kind of an implication in here that the ecosystem would benefit from deep salinity intrusion into the Delta, and I don't think that's the case.
Really?
The establishment of the clams in the Suisun Bay, a lot of people think as a result of having made the Suisun Marsh more saline than it was historically on a seasonal basis. the salinity incursions that we're talking about to improve the situation really involve more freshwater outflow to make it less saline during times of the year to discourage the overbite clams from establishing themselves. But I haven't seen, certainly the historical establishment of the anadromous fisheries and the native fisheries in the delta didn't depend upon deep salinity intrusion because we didn't have that except in very extreme drought situations in 1 or 2 months out of the year. So I think that implication needs to be cleaned up. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rentz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to actually have general comments. First of all, I appreciate the fact that the staff has laid out a lot of recommendations, especially if you look at page 227 and 228, 229, and I guess it even carries over into 230. Individual recommendations for what the water board should do, what the state water board should do, what the regional water board should do, and give deadlines for that. We're most appreciative always of the fact that specific elements are identified. But one thing that's missing in this chapter, and I think it goes back to some of the comments that were in the chapter 2, is a discussion about how there's going to be a coordination, integration, a discussion with the state water board, regional water boards, where some of these issues involve Department of Pesticide Regulation, Department of Public Health, because, I mean, quite frankly, this is a heck of a undertaking that's being proposed here in a 3-year period of time, and we hear everybody talk about resource limitations, and so one of the comments I'd make on this chapter is it would be, whether it's specifically in this chapter or covered in greater detail as we've suggested in chapter 2, there really needs to be discussion about the reality of what you're going to be able to do when given resources and given, as the chair pointed out, the various authorities and responsibilities amongst these agencies. I think that's critical. A second point I would like to reiterate, and I think it is a great opportunity for the council, is as we start exploring opportunities, and they've already been initiated, so I don't want to sound like we're starting at point zero, but as we start exploring opportunities to further advance, expand the toolbox of water, whether it's recycled water, use of stormwater, there are going to be a lot of water quality questions that arise, and I think that's an excellent opportunity for the council in coordination with the state water board to start having those dialogues. I know they're already happening at the state water board. I don't want to dismiss that fact, but this is again a chance for an integration role and coordination role of the Delta Stewardship Council that the coalition has time and time again said is what we consider the most crucial role, and that's even pointed out by your staff in the chapter 2. So those are comments. Final thing I will leave with is I believe chapter 6 is actually it's an extremely critical. Let me leave it at that. Extremely critical chapter. I'm speaking on behalf of Aqua and being the director of regulatory affairs. We are seeing a significant increase in the issues that are being handled by the regulatory agencies in the context of water quality. I think, Felicia, given your background, you can understand the reason why. Things have changed a lot as far as regulatory expectations with regards to water quality. So I think this chapter provides some great opportunities that haven't quite been identified by the staff as to how the council will work to facilitate a dialogue that will allow for a more strategic approach to these issues. And that's the end of my comment.
Can I ask a question? Mark, do you think one way to deal with this is, as we going to the earlier discussion about how to hone the conversation about this interagency coordinating council, and I'm not saying we should do this, of course my instinct is that we should, but would it work to meet that concern for us to just suggest that water quality would be the first issue we would convene the interagency group around to prioritize and focus on it? Or should we just be more specific about, within this chapter, about what you're suggesting?
In all honesty, I hadn't given any thought to that, Felicia. What should be first, what should be second. I think one incumbent for the IIC when it comes together, and why when we commented on that issue yesterday, we said why we thought it was so important for affected local agencies as well as affected water agencies from our perspective. I'm sure others have that perspective being involved. Is I think that should be one of the first charges to the IIC. I'm assuming that the council is going to spend some time deliberating on what they want from their IIC, just like you did with the independent science board, and that's going to be an ongoing thing. To say it's the first, I think everybody in here could say no, maybe this somewhere else should be the first, but I think it should be identified as a critical element that you would like to see from the IIC, if that's the governing body that you're looking at doing that, develop a work plan for how they're going to start to address this myriad of water quality issues that they can bring back to the council and have a dialogue with the council and other key agencies in concert with the council having that discussion.
All right. Well, it suggests at a minimum that in our chart, I know we do say other state agencies, we should make sure that we have the health department included, because drinking water is a key issue here. I don't know that we've thought about them.
Yeah, and one last thing, I do think you made a good point. I'm going to try and find real quickly on the issues for future evaluation and coordination. I don't think that's a full issue, a full range of issues. I'm sure there's other ones out there. And as I looked at that section, some of these issues might have higher priority as you look to time frame for future, as opposed to others. So I throw that out there to you, too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Mike?
I think this is one of those chapters that's important to the linkage, and following a little bit up on what Mark has said, I think it's language on page 207, lines 8, 9, and 10. The council's role with respect to water quality is to ensure the policy and recommendations balance, protect, et cetera. You're depending upon other agencies to do this, and there's no indication of oversight reporting or accountability with respect to those agencies other than the stating of timelines. And I think you diffuse the importance of this when in lines 19 to 21 when you talk about what you envision. The interagency council may be a tool to be able to achieve this, but I harken back to what Gardner said about the Delta Vision process. This council either has got to say, this is what you're responsible for, we're going to look at it, we're going to report it, and we're going to embarrass you if you don't perform, in order to be able to make sure that this happens. Otherwise, this is just another nice report that identifies everything that's wrong and how you should fix it that others can ignore.
Thanks. I would say for the most part, we think, I concur actually with the comments that Felicia made at the beginning, but for the most part, we are comfortable with this chapter and the recommendations that have been made in this draft. We think they're on the right direction. I will also concur with Mike, what I think was the gist of Mike's comments, that beyond listing some guidance would be useful. The piece of this that I really wanted to focus on, though, was the science and information needs list, which I think is a good list of issues. What we see here, however, is an opportunity for the council to help craft a standard for how to
That's
move
page 231.
Right. So my comments are less on the list itself than the fact of the existence of the list and what to do about this. Because I think, Chairman, you made exactly the right point, which is that science around these issues will become contentious, or is potentially contentious going forward. We see here a real opportunity, a golden opportunity for the council to use its stature to help craft a widely accepted standard for what is meant by best available science. And this is obviously an issue that moves beyond just the water quality chapter into all the other chapters, but I thought I would take advantage of this to make this point. Because what we have seen, and you have certainly seen a great deal of this, is this constant sort of dueling experts. What is meant by good science? How much science is enough? What's bad science? What types of correlations and relationships can agencies reasonably rely on in making their decisions, and what can't they? There's an enormous amount of time and funding on dueling science and experts, and while this isn't a silver bullet, nothing's ever going to make disagreements go away, I think a standard that has broad buy-in by all of the various entities and stakeholders, and of course the agencies themselves, which is key, can at least narrow that and help us to avoid some of the extraordinary time and level of contentiousness in these issues. And this council, I think, is uniquely positioned to do that, because your mandate is to coordinate and to and you have the consistency function among all of these jurisdictions. So of all of the agencies, so many of the agencies in the Delta that have jurisdiction in the Delta and have decision-making authority in the Delta are in a position of having to, in one way or another, have their decisions informed by the scientific process. But there really isn't a uniform agreement among anybody about what that looks like. And, so we do waste a lot of time in a lot of these forums talking about this is good science, this is bad science. So I don't have an advocacy position for you on what is or is not good science, but I only think it is our recommendation that you do provide a policy, and maybe it's an overarching policy as opposed to one in just this chapter, sort of saying we need to develop a commonly accepted standard for best available science and for how scientific information should be used by agencies across the board in their decision making. So I hope you'll consider that, and even in my new capacity, I think we will be available to help you develop that.
Is it possible that within a week of your taking your new position over, we could have a definitive paper presented to us of your options and alternatives on this?
Yes.
We've been struggling to try to get questions like, what's the right process to determine best available science in an operational sense, not a theoretical sense.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's definitely something we can help you with, and I believe there will be a forthcoming law review article.
And it's July 1st you go to the
9th.
July. Mr. Grindstaff, would you please note in the minutes that Ms. Kohler will produce her report 7 days after the 9th? Or the
July 16th.
July 16th. Thank you very much.
And I'm going to ask that Mr. Grindstaff note that this is at least the dozenth time that Chairman Eisenberg has assigned me to tasks, so he apparently believes that I'm on his staff, but I'm delighted to take on the assignment.
Actually, you volunteered for this one. I'm just memorializing it.
You should have your office next to his.
There will be a
Sounds
vacancy
like
soon.
somebody wanting relief.
Mr. Wilcox.
Well, I will definitely look forward to Cynthia's product, since this is an issue that I think is relevant. But I think, a strong science program broadly throughout in relationship to the plan is important to all of the things that go on in the Delta relative to decision making, since most of this is ultimately going to be in an adaptive context. I also would support Mike's point relative to holding people accountable. That is your charge as far as I'm concerned. And so, his points relative to the water quality components apply throughout. And I think, the recent report card from the Delta Vision Foundation, I know our agency pays attention to it. We were happy to see that our grade went up. So I think it's important. And, that was the shortcoming of CalFed, was that nobody was really accountable. So, I think that's an important component. With that, we don't have any specific comments relative to Chapter 6, and I need to leave, and we don't have comments relative to 7 or the financing chapter at this point. So.
Except a stable and secure funding source for the
Correct.
Department of Fish and Game is essential.
Right.
Got it. Okay. Randy.
Carl, I want to take the opportunity while you're still here. Tom mentioned the concern about an inclusion in Chapter 6 that refers to increasing salinity in the Delta in terms of ag water quality. In Chapter 4, we talk a lot about the science view of fluctuating salinity, which I think is different than increasing salinity. At least I don't. Okay. So what's
Mr. Zuckerman nods yes, it is different.
What's the view of the fluctuating salinity approach to addressing some of the invasives, and do you feel that we've adequately addressed it in Chapter 4, and is it concurrently adequately mentioned in Chapter 6?
I think the idea of fluctuating salinity or any kind of fluctuation in environmental parameters is in an estuarine situation is part of that system. You know, estuaries fluctuate relative to inflow or the effects of tidal. You know, I think this is an area of certainly uncertainty. I think, as Tom pointed out, you know, the historical record, you know, or I think the fellow from Bethel Island pointed out about the CNH cannery. You know, they used to get fresh water there most of the year, and drought conditions, they'd have to go up to Sacramento to get their water supply. So, you know, certainly there are fluctuations. I think the idea that came out of, I think, the initial PPIC report that talked about increasing salinity seasonally into the delta to deal with clams is not necessarily really well supported by kind of the historical record or our current understanding. It's an open question. I think, you know, the dynamics of these invasive populations shift over time as they become entrenched and the environment equilibrates. I think this year we saw, or not this year, but in 2011 with high outflow, we saw that outflow affected the clams and their effect on productivity in the system. So we saw an increase in productivity, a suppression. Some wildlife species, sturgeon and diving ducks in particular, have a substantial effect in the winter for the waterfowl in the winter on clams. So it's a dynamic thing. I think the idea of fluctuating salinity was particularly focused on Egeria. You know, I don't know that, you know, drawing Egeria or salinity into the central and deep into the delta is something that the department's particularly interested in from the perspective of native fishes, because that's, you know, we've made recommendations about outflow requirements that would counter that. So I think, you know, that idea is an open question and one that I don't know that has really broad support. It's an uncertainty that we have, and it might be, but it certainly has significant effects on agriculture.
All right. Thank you very much. Mrs. Lotnick.
Yes. Quickly, first of all, I appreciate the focus on water quality in the report, and although we agree, I think with Felicia's assessment that it probably needs to be buffed up a bit back what was there before, we do appreciate it. One specific suggestion on page 230.
230.
It discusses talking about the development of nutrient objectives for the Delta and Sassoon Marsh. And right now there's activity going on at the State Board and the San Francisco Regional Board to develop such objectives, and there's a lot of active research going on. And so the notion that we need to wait until 2018 to get it done seems rather remote. And so we suggest maybe talking with the State Board and seeing if you can get that date a little sooner would make sense.
Let's just ask Mr. Grindstaff and the science folks to review that issue and tell us what they think is the appropriate course.
That's fine.
Okay.
And then, Felicia, your comment with Department of Health Services, and Mark bringing it up, is well taken. Also, not just in general for drinking water quality parameters, but also for the use of water for groundwater recharge, getting into recycled water issues and things like that, and also just remediating groundwater that's contaminated, you know, dealing with those issues is important. And then I would concur with Mike's comments and Cynthia's on the science, and I think that, as you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, that NRC report gives you a pretty good discussion of the as Cynthia sort of alluded to, kind of trying to get away from the battle of experts, if you will, and try to get some agreement, at least on fundamental facts within the science that needs to be undertaken. And I think, again, that you guys are, and we've said this before, the council has a unique ability and charge to pull the agencies together to do that, and that the IAC, it's not just to pull the agencies together on a particular issue, but it's prioritizing activities to further the co-equal goals broadly, and we think that's important. And then Mike's comment about your obligation or your ability to essentially hold agencies' feet to the fire is very important, and to make sure we're actually moving and not getting stuck in analysis paralysis. So, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Bardini.
Well, really at this point on this subject here, we'd say water quality is good.
That's better than bad.
But at this point, I don't have anything to add to the comment.
Okay. All right. Yes, Mr. Morenz.
If I could just a couple.
Get closer to the mic so the folks.
A couple more follow-up comments, if I could, that were stimulated by people who followed me. Is first of all, looking at water quality, WQ R9 on starting on line 32 on page 230 about the implement Delta Regional Monitoring Program. Great deal of value, I believe, is with the concept, but it's easy to lay out that concept. But what's critical is the strategy for implementing that concept. We've seen numerous efforts to implement monitoring programs that are not integrated with one another, and the result is a lot of data is gathered and not necessarily used, not necessarily integrated with one another, not necessarily the questions up front asked as to what is the questions you're trying to answer with your monitoring. I think that's where some real value of this recommendation to come into play. I can't tell you the number of monitoring requirements that are imposed on an individual basis for our members, which leads me to the second point I wanted to reiterate, maybe I should in my opening comments, a concurrence with what everybody said so far about the importance of science, and also understanding that these things, some of them take a period of time to do the science, especially given the levels of expectations that are evolving from the U.S. EPA, state water board, and regional water boards. In a period of about a decade, we've gone from water quality standards or MCLs, maximum contaminant levels that were talked about in parts to million, to parts to billion, to now we're hearing in parts to trillion. And I'm not here to debate whether those are real numbers. That's for the scientists to have. But when you move to those magnitude of changes of expectations, the science has to be given the time necessary to evaluate, because the costs associated for my members to respond to when you move from parts to million to parts to billion to parts to trillion, and in some cases the technology may not even be there yet to respond to those levels. So I wanted to bring that forward too, because I think it's important, and also sometimes the impacts of a particular contaminant are not learned till after the fact. I call your attention to, given again from a past life I had, you look at the two bulleted recommendations on line 8 through 10 and 11 through 13 on page 230. I find it interesting how they're juxtapositioned with the two of each other. The first one talks about diazinon and chlorpyrifos. The second one talks about pyrethroids. Pyrethroids were designed to resolve water quality concerns associated with organic phosphates, which is diazinon and chlorpyrifos. And quite honestly, when pyrethroids came into play, we thought we had addressed the concern in the water column. It wasn't until 10 years later that we started learning that the problem associated with pyrethroids is not necessarily in the water column, but is in the sediment to which it attaches at the bottom but that took time to learn that science. So I think it's important that we respect the fact that how critical good science is, and that good science often doesn't happen at the speed that policymakers would wish that it would. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. All right. Questions by members of the council? There are no staff open items on this chapter. Mr. Grindstaff, you've been listening to this stuff. Mr. Ray, anything you're going to be following up on, apart from the one mention that we'd agreed you'll take a look at the argument Mr. Zlotnick made on nutrients.
And everything I said.
And everything, Felicia. Well, let's see. Summarize in shorthand form, Ms. Marcus, those things.
I just think there has to be I think the staff has to go through and look at the setup and the recommendations to make sure they're consistent, that they've adequately set up the recommendations, or that they've made recommendations when they've set things up. Add the Department of Health Services into the list of agencies earlier in the document.
And more on disadvantaged communities.
Joe, turn the mic on, please.
Right.
It should be on.
Well, then speak more loudly.
Okay, there we go. The other thing you mentioned was disadvantaged communities. Adding that. So more depth on a setup for some of the policies and recommendations.
All right, add the dissolved oxygen as a performance measure possibility.
Yeah,
to your
I
list,
actually
please.
found a performance measure on dissolved oxygen after you were talking.
And is it clearly and explicitly worded on dissolved oxygen?
Yes, it is.
Then I just
Progress
missed.
towards consistently meeting applicable dissolved oxygen standards in the Delta by 2020.
What applicable standards?
Well, the Water Board establishes the objectives
They
for
have-
all these parameters.
Then mention progress in meeting the Water Board standards adopted X date and as subsequently amended as the performance measure. You can't just assume a precision that you do not have in the language.
Okay, got it.
All right.
Also, I think that this point about holding agencies accountable and being restricted, this is a comment I made earlier that I think held throughout the document that a number of the panelists talked about. I'd like you to do a sweep on that.
I want to echo that. I think as we look towards implementation, somebody pointed out that's our role. And if we don't establish an outline in the plan as to who it is that we're going to be looking to be accountable for certain actions, then and it's not in the plan, then it's going to have to be. So we might as well start now, and as we can, identify those. And I agree with Felicia, in every chapter. Okay.